The crystal frame slipped from Jung Woo-jin's trembling fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor of his Seattle penthouse office. 20 years he'd kept that photograph hidden, buried beneath financial documents, locked away in the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk like a shameful secret. 20 years of building walls around the memory of a chubby 9-year-old boy who'd lost everything that mattered. But his new maid had just walked into his private sanctuary with a feather duster and somehow managed to knock over the one stack of papers that contained his deepest shame. The photo now lay face up between them, a faded school picture of a round-faced Korean boy with thick glasses, clutching a lunchbox decorated with cartoon characters, his smile hopeful, despite the sadness lurking in his dark eyes. "Oh my God," Zara Hassan whispered, her cleaning supplies forgotten as she stared at the image. Her voice carried a recognition that made Woo-jin's blood run cold. "That's the boy who shared his food with me." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Woo-jin's carefully constructed identity, the intimidating security company owner, whose employees whispered about his connections and whose business meetings happened behind closed doors, began crumbling as he watched this woman he'd hired just yesterday piece together a puzzle he'd spent decades trying to forget. She was supposed to be just another employee from elite cleaning services, someone who would dust his furniture and disappear into the background of his meticulously controlled life. What she wasn't supposed to do was recognize the lonely child he'd been at Lincoln Elementary's free lunch program. "You're mistaken," he said, but his voice lacked its usual commanding edge. "I don't know what you're talking about." But Zara's dark eyes, intelligent, determined, and suddenly soft with memory, told him she knew exactly what she was talking about. And in that moment, Woo-jin realized that some ghosts refuse to stay buried, especially when they're standing 3 feet away, wearing rubber gloves and remembering a kindness he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Zara Hassan had cleaned mansions, penthouses, and tech moguls' offices, but she'd never felt quite this intimidated. Jung Woo-jin's Seattle penthouse screamed money and power, from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay to the Korean artifacts that probably cost more than her annual rent. And the man himself, all 6 feet of controlled authority in an expensive suit, watched her every move like he expected her to steal the silverware. "The agency said you have excellent references, Gunn," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet command that made people listen. "I trust that won't be a problem." Zara clutched her cleaning supplies tighter, acutely aware that this job was her lifeline. 6 months ago, she'd been an investigative journalist with a steady paycheck and a promising career. Then budget cuts hit the Seattle Tribune, and suddenly she was 32 years old, scrambling to pay rent by cleaning other people's homes. "No problem at all, Mr. Jung," she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "I'll have everything spotless." What she didn't mention was that she'd never actually been a professional cleaner before last month. What she also didn't mention was that she recognized something familiar about his face, something that tugged at memories she'd buried under years of professional ambition and adult responsibilities. "My office is off limits," Woo-jin said, gesturing toward a set of double doors. "Everything else is fair game. Mrs. Nakamura next door has a spare key if you need anything while I'm out." He moved with the kind of fluid grace that suggested either expensive personal training or something more dangerous. His employees at Jung Security Solutions whispered about their boss's mysterious past, about meetings that happened after hours and clients who paid in cash. Zara had heard the rumors. Everyone in Seattle's service industry gossiped about their wealthy employers. But standing in his pristine living room, she wondered if the intimidating reputation was just careful cultivation. "I'll start with the kitchen," she said, then immediately regretted it when she realized she had no idea where the kitchen was in this sprawling penthouse. Woo-jin's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "Through that doorway. Try not to break anything expensive." The comment stung because it was probably fair. In her first week of professional cleaning, Zara had already broken 2 vases, shrunk a cashmere sweater, and somehow turned a client's white shirts pink. But she needed this job, needed the money, needed the references, needed to prove she could rebuild her life from scratch. "Of course not," she said with more confidence than she felt. But as Woo-jin left for his mysterious business meetings, Zara found herself drawn to the personal touches that humanized the intimidating space. Family photos showed him with an older man who looked like a father figure. Charity event pictures revealed his involvement in Korean cultural organizations, and everywhere she looked, there were signs of someone who cared deeply about his heritage and community. It was while dusting his bookshelf, Korean literature mixed with business texts and what looked like children's books in both languages, that she accidentally knocked over a stack of papers on his desk. And that's when she saw it, the photograph that changed everything. The boy in the picture was maybe 9 years old, with round cheeks and thick glasses that made his eyes look enormous. He wore a school uniform that was slightly too big, and he clutched a lunchbox like it contained treasure. But it was his smile that broke her heart, hopeful and kind despite the sadness that seemed to radiate from his small frame. "Jimmy," she whispered, the nickname falling from her lips before she could stop it. Because suddenly she was 8 years old again, sitting in Lincoln Elementary's cafeteria with the free lunch kids, watching a quiet Korean boy split his sandwich in half, even when it was clearly the only food he'd get all day. She remembered how he'd slide half across the table to her without a word, how he'd pretended not to notice when she was too proud to say thank you, how his kindness had been the only bright spot in a childhood, marked by foster homes and uncertainty. "You told me your name was Jimmy," she said to the empty room, her voice thick with 20 years of buried emotion. "You always sat by the window and you'd share your food even when you were hungrier than any of us." The sound of the front door opening made her jump, and she quickly tried to reorganize the papers she'd scattered. But it was too late. Woo Jin was walking into his office, probably to retrieve something he'd forgotten, and she was standing there with his childhood photograph in her hands and tears streaming down her face. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, but his voice lost its edge when he saw what she was holding. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was dusting and I accidentally knocked over—" "Put it down," he said quietly, and there was something vulnerable in his voice that made her heart ache. But Zara couldn't put it down, not when she was looking at the face of the boy who'd taught her that kindness existed in the world, the boy who'd shared his lunch with a scared little girl who had nothing to offer in return. "You called me Little Z," she said softly. Because you said my real name was too pretty to use in a place like that." Woo Jin went very still, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "Zara," he said finally, and the way he said her name, like a prayer, like a memory, like a wound that had never quite healed, told her that he remembered too. "You shared your food with me," she whispered, "every day for 3 months, until I got moved to a different foster home. You never asked why I was alone, never made me feel like charity. You just cared." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of 2 decades and the impossible coincidence that had brought them back together. Outside, Seattle's business district hummed with legitimate commerce, while inside this penthouse, a struggling house cleaner and a successful businessman confronted the children they used to be. "I thought you were dead," Woo Jin said finally, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "When you stopped coming to school, I thought something had happened to you." The admission broke something inside her chest, and Zara felt tears she'd been holding back for 20 years finally spill over. "I looked for you," she said. "When I became a journalist, I tried to find you, but Jimmy wasn't your real name, and I didn't know your last name, and I became someone else," he said, moving closer but still maintaining careful distance. "Jimmy was weak. Jimmy couldn't protect anyone. Young Woo Jin built walls that no one could break down. But you're still him," Zara said, gesturing at the photograph. "You're still the boy who shared his lunch." Woo Jin's laugh was bitter. That boy was naive. He thought kindness mattered. He thought if he was good enough, gentle enough, maybe his sister wouldn't disappear. Maybe the people he cared about would stay. The mention of his sister hit Zara like a physical blow. She remembered Minji, a tiny 7-year-old who sometimes sat with them, who worshipped her big brother and made him smile in a way that transformed his serious face. She remembered the day Minji stopped coming to lunch, remembered how Jimmy's kindness had turned desperate as he saved food for a sister who never returned. "Minji," she whispered. Woo Jin's composure finally cracked, and Zara saw the boy he'd been, lost, scared, trying to hold together a world that kept falling apart. "She was placed with a family," he said. "That's what they told me. But I never saw her again. Never heard from her. For all I know, she forgot I ever existed." "You became successful to find her," Zara realized. "The security company, the connections, the reputation. It's also you'd have the resources to search for her." "Fat lot of good it's done," he said bitterly. 20 years of building an empire, and I'm no closer to finding her than I was when I was 9 years old." Zara set the photograph carefully on his desk and took a step toward him. "I'm a journalist," she said. "I specialize in missing persons cases, cold cases, families separated by the system. I could help you find her." Wu Jin's eyes widened with something that might have been hope before his walls slammed back into place. "You're a house cleaner." "I'm a house cleaner who used to be an investigative journalist," she corrected. "I lost my job 6 months ago, but I still have contacts, resources, skills. I could help you." "Why?" he asked suspiciously. "What do you want in return?" The question hurt, but Zara understood it. In his world, kindness always came with a price. "Because you shared your lunch with me," she said simply. "Because you taught me that good people exist in the world. Because maybe it's time I returned the favor." The next morning brought chaos in the form of Mrs. Betty Nakamura's voice echoing through the penthouse hallway, accompanied by the enthusiastic barking of Rocky Balboa, Wu Jin's 70-pound rescue dog who had never met a dramatic entrance he couldn't make worse. "Wu Jin," Mrs. Nakamura called as she let herself in with the spare key. "Your new maid left her car in the visitor parking overnight. I hope you're not running some kind of boarding house situation, because the HOA has very strict rules about—" "Oh." She stopped short when she found Zara sitting at Wu Jin's dining room table, surrounded by manila folders and looking nothing like a woman who'd come to clean. Rocky, meanwhile, had bounded over to investigate the newcomer, his tail wagging with the enthusiasm of a dog who decided she was definitely friend, not foe. "Mrs. Nakamura," Wu Jin said carefully, emerging from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee, "Zara and I are working on a project." The elderly woman's eyes narrowed behind her rhinestone-studded glasses. "What kind of project requires a maid to stay overnight? And why does she have more paperwork than my accountant?" Zara looked up from the missing persons database she'd been searching on her laptop. "I'm helping Mr. Jung with some research," she said diplomatically. "Research," Mrs. Nakamura repeated, her tone suggesting she'd heard more convincing lies from her late husband when he'd tried to hide his poker nights. "Is this the kind of research that explains why you've been crying? Because your eyes are all red and puffy." "Mrs. Nakamura," Wu Jin warned, but the woman was already settling into a chair with the determination of someone who'd appointed herself chief investigator of the building's romantic developments. "I've lived in this building for 15 years, she announced, "and I've seen exactly 3 women spend the night in this apartment. The first was that awful real estate agent who thought she could convince you to sell. The second was your cousin from Portland who needed a place to stay after her divorce. And now we have Zara, who's supposedly here to clean, but is actually doing research that makes both of you look like you've been through an emotional blender." Rocky, sensing an opportunity for attention, dropped his favorite toy, a stuffed kimchi plushie that Kevin Jung had given Wu Jin as a joke, directly in Mrs. Nakamura's lap. The sight of the serious elderly woman being presented with a cartoon vegetable by an overly enthusiastic rescue dog was enough to break some of the tension in the room. "He likes you," Wu Jin observed. "Rocky doesn't usually share his toys with strangers." "I'm not a stranger," Mrs. Nakamura said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "I'm the person who feeds him treats when you're working late and pretends not to notice when he escapes to the dog park without permission." Zara couldn't help but smile at the interaction. "You have a good support system," she told Wu Jin. "Mrs. Nakamura obviously cares about you." "She also has opinions about everything I do," he replied, but there was affection in his voice. "Including my hiring practices, apparently." "Well, your hiring practices are questionable," Mrs. Nakamura said bluntly. "In the 3 weeks since Elite Cleaning Services started sending people, you've gone through 4 different cleaners, And now suddenly this one is doing research instead of dusting. Something doesn't add up. Zara and Wu Jin exchanged glances, and she could see him weighing how much to reveal. The truth was complicated, too complicated for a casual explanation to a curious neighbor. "We knew each other as children," Zara said finally. "We lost touch, and now we're trying to reconnect with some shared history." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Mrs. Nakamura's expression softened slightly, though her investigative instincts remained sharp. "Childhood friends," she mused. "That explains the emotional blender situation, but it doesn't explain why you're living in your car." "I'm not living in my car," Zara protested. "Honey, I've been watching from my balcony. You've been sitting in that Honda Civic for 3 hours every morning before coming up here, and you had a pillow and blanket in the back seat. Either you're conducting some very elaborate surveillance, or you're between housing situations." The observation hit too close to home, and Zara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She'd been so careful to maintain her professional facade, but apparently she'd been more transparent than she'd realized. "It's temporary," she said quietly. "I'm between apartments." Between apartments was a generous way to describe her situation. The truth was that she'd been evicted from her studio apartment 2 weeks ago and had been sleeping in her car while trying to save enough money for a new security deposit. The elite cleaning services job was supposed to be her salvation: steady income, flexible hours, and the possibility of building enough financial stability to get back on her feet. "That settles it," Mrs. Nakamura announced with the authority of someone who'd made an executive decision. "You'll stay in my guest room until you find something permanent. I've been rattling around that apartment alone since Harold died, and I could use the company." "I couldn't possibly—" Zara started. "Nonsense. You're helping Wu Jin with important research. You're clearly a good person if Rocky likes you, and I refuse to let anyone sleep in their car when I have a perfectly good spare bedroom sitting empty." Wu Jin looked surprised by his neighbor's generosity, but not displeased. "Mrs. Nakamura, that's very kind of you." "It's practical," she corrected. "Besides, this way I can keep an eye on whatever this research project actually involves. I have a feeling there's more to this story than childhood friendship." Rocky chose that moment to demonstrate his approval of the arrangement by bringing Zara his second favorite toy, a rope that had seen better days but was apparently a great honor to receive. As she accepted the soggy offering, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the warmth of belonging somewhere, even temporarily. "Thank you," she said to Mrs. Nakamura, her voice thick with gratitude. "I promise I won't be any trouble." "Trouble is exactly what this building needs," the elderly woman replied with a mischievous smile. "It's been far too quiet around here lately." As if summoned by the mention of quiet, Wu Jin's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and his expression grew serious. "I have to take this," he said, stepping into his office and closing the door. Mrs. Nakamura waited exactly 3 seconds before leaning towards Zara conspiratorially. "So," she said in a stage whisper, "what's the real story? And don't give me any more nonsense about research projects. I've been married for 53 years and raised 4 children. I know when people are dancing around the truth." Zara looked toward the closed office door, then back at Mrs. Nakamura's expectant face. Rocky had settled at her feet, apparently content to serve as a furry lie detector. "We're looking for his sister," she said finally. "She disappeared when we were children, and we're trying to find her." The simple truth seemed to satisfy Mrs. Nakamura in a way that the vague explanations hadn't. Her expression softened with understanding and something that might have been maternal concern. "Missing family," she said quietly. "That explains everything. The sadness, the determination, the way you both look like you're carrying the weight of the world. How long has she been gone?" 20 years, Zara replied, "since she was 7 years old." Mrs. Nakamura was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what they were attempting. "That's a long time," she said finally. "But not too long. I've seen stranger reunions happen. My neighbor in Tacoma found her birth mother after 40 years of searching." "Really? Really? It took persistence, luck, and the right connections. But it happened." Mrs. Nakamura reached over and patted Zara's hand. "And if anyone can find a missing person, It's an investigative journalist with a personal stake in the outcome. The vote of confidence meant more than Zara could express. For months she'd felt like a failure. A journalist without a job, a woman without a home, someone whose life had fallen apart despite her best efforts. But sitting in Woo Jin's dining room with Mrs. Nakamura's encouragement and Rocky's warm weight against her feet, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. "We should probably get back to work," she said, as Woo Jin's voice grew louder behind the office door. "I have a lot of databases to search." "And I have a guest room to prepare," Mrs. Nakamura said, standing with the energy of someone who'd found a new project. "But first, I'm calling Chef Kang and ordering lunch for all of us. Research is hungry work, and you both look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in days." As if on cue, Zara's stomach rumbled loudly enough to make Rocky lift his head in interest. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten something that wasn't from a vending machine or a fast food drive-through. "That's very kind," she said, "but You should probably accept help when it's offered," Mrs. Nakamura interrupted gently. "Trust me, honey. I've been where you are. Sometimes the hardest part of rebuilding your life is letting people care about you." The words hit deeper than they should have, touching on fears and insecurities that Zara had been trying to ignore. She'd spent so many years being independent, being strong, being the person who helped others that she'd forgotten how to accept help herself. "Thank you," she said simply, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. Mrs. Nakamura smiled, with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully adopted another stray. "Good. Now, let's see what we can do about finding this missing sister of his. I may be retired, but I still have connections in the social services system. Sometimes the best investigations start with knowing who to call." Chef Kang arrived with enough food to feed a small army, and the kind of maternal concern that transcended language barriers. He took one look at Zara's thin frame and immediately began unpacking containers while muttering in rapid Korean that sounded distinctly disapproving. "He says you're too skinny," Woo Jin translated as he emerged from his office, his business call apparently concluded, "and that anyone who works as hard as you do needs proper nutrition." "I told him about the research project," Mrs. Nakamura explained, not bothering to mention that she'd also shared her theories about the romantic potential of the situation. "He's very invested in the outcome." Chef Kang nodded seriously and launched into another stream of Korean, this time directed at Woo Jin, with the kind of intensity that suggested he was receiving detailed instructions. "He wants to know about Minji," Woo Jin said quietly. "He remembers her from when I used to bring her to the restaurant." Zara looked up from the bulgogi she'd been cautiously tasting. It was the best thing she'd eaten in months. "You brought her to his restaurant?" "Every Sunday after I started working," Woo Jin said, settling into the chair across from her. "I was 14, washing dishes at a hotel downtown. Chef Kang's place was the only Korean restaurant I could afford, and Minji loved the kimchi jjigae. She said it reminded her of our grandmother's cooking." Chef Kang's expression grew soft at the memory, and he pulled out his phone to show them a faded photo of a much younger Woo Jin sitting at a corner table, with a tiny girl who was clearly his sister. Minji couldn't have been more than 6 in the picture, but her smile was radiant as she posed with a bowl bigger than her head. "She was beautiful," Zara said softly, studying the image. "She looks just like you." "She was everything good about our family," Woo Jin replied. "Smart, funny, brave. She used to say she was going to be a teacher so she could help other kids like us." Chef Kang spoke again, his tone urgent, and Woo Jin's expression grew thoughtful as he listened. "What's he saying?" Zara asked. "He's reminding me about the Korean Community Center," Woo Jin said slowly. "They keep records of families, especially families who've been separated. If Minji was placed with a Korean family, there might be documentation." Mrs. Nakamura perked up with interest. "That's brilliant. Community organizations often have better records than official agencies, especially for cultural placements. I should have thought of that years ago," Woo Jin said, looking frustrated with himself. "I was so focused on official channels, private investigators, legal searches. I never considered the community angle." "You were thinking like someone who'd been hurt by the system," Zara said gently. "It makes sense that you'd look for official solutions, but sometimes the best information comes from unofficial sources. Chef Kang nodded approvingly and launched into what sounded like a detailed plan, complete with hand gestures and the occasional English word thrown in for emphasis. "He knows someone at the community center," Wu Jin translated. "Mrs. Park has been there for 30 years, and she remembers every family that's come through their programs. He wants to call her this afternoon." "That's wonderful," Zara said, feeling a surge of excitement. "We should also check with the Korean churches in the area. If a family adopted Minji, they might have been involved in the religious community." "And the Korean school programs," Mrs. Nakamura added. "If they wanted to maintain her cultural connection, they would have enrolled her in weekend language classes." Rocky, apparently sensing the excitement in the room, decided to contribute by bringing everyone his collection of toys: the kimchi plushie, the rope, and a squeaky ball that had seen better days. He deposited them in the center of the table like offerings to the investigation gods. "Even Rocky wants to help," Zara laughed, scratching behind his ears. "We're building quite a team here." Chef Kang's phone rang, and he answered with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting for this call his entire life. The conversation that followed was rapid and animated, with lots of ahs and ohs that suggested significant developments. "Mrs. Park remembers," Wu Jin said, his voice tight with emotion as he translated the call in real time. "She remembers a 7-year-old girl named Minji, who was placed with a family in 2004. The family name was Kim, and they lived in Bellevue." Zara's heart started racing. "That's incredibly specific. Does she have contact information?" Chef Kang spoke again, his tone more cautious now. "The family moved to Portland in 2010, Wu Jin continued. Mrs. Park lost touch with them after that, but she thinks she might have old records in storage. Portland is only 3 hours away," Mrs. Nakamura said practically, "and Portland has a large Korean community. If they're still there, someone will know them." "This is happening so fast," Zara said, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden progress. "Yesterday we didn't even know where to start, and now we have names, locations, potential leads." "Sometimes that's how it works," Wu Jin said, but his voice carried a note of caution. "Sometimes you get lucky, and everything falls into place. But Zara..." He looked at her seriously. "You need to be prepared for the possibility that she doesn't want to be found, that she's built a life that doesn't include me." The words hung in the air like a challenge to hope. Zara could see the fear behind his careful control, the fear that his sister had forgotten him, that she was happy without him, that his 20-year search would end in rejection rather than reunion. "Maybe," she said carefully, "but maybe she's been looking for you too. Maybe she's spent 20 years wondering what happened to her big brother, who shared his lunch and took her for kimchi jjigae every Sunday." Chef Kang ended his call and immediately launched into another enthusiastic speech, this time accompanied by gestures toward his restaurant. "He wants to cook for her," Wu Jin translated, his voice thick with emotion. "When we find her, he wants to make kimchi jjigae just like she used to love. He's been saving the recipe, hoping she'd come back someday." The simple gesture of faith, a chef saving a recipe for 20 years on the chance that a lost little girl might return, broke something open in Zara's chest. She looked around the table at this unlikely group of allies: a successful businessman carrying 20 years of guilt, an elderly neighbor who'd opened her home to a stranger, a chef who'd never stopped hoping, and a dog who seemed determined to love everyone equally. "We're going to find her," she said with a conviction that surprised her. "I don't know how, and I don't know when, but we're going to find her." Mrs. Nakamura raised her water glass in a toast. "To Minji," she said solemnly, "and to the family that's been waiting for her to come home." "To Minji," they echoed, and even Rocky seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, settling quietly at Wu Jin's feet, with his head resting on his master's shoe. As they began making concrete plans, who would call which organizations, how they'd coordinate the search, what they'd do if they actually found her, Zara felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the sense of belonging to something bigger than herself. She was no longer just an unemployed journalist sleeping in her car. She was part of a mission, part of a family, part of something that mattered. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Some stories really did have happy endings. 3 days later, Zara found herself in the passenger seat of Wu Jin's Mercedes, watching the Oregon countryside blur past as they drove toward what might be the most important meeting of his life. Mrs. Park had found the records, 20-year-old documents that confirmed Minji had been placed with the Kim family in Bellevue before their move to Portland in 2010. "You don't have to do this," Wu Jin said for the 3rd time since they'd left Seattle. "I can handle it alone." "You could," Zara agreed, adjusting the folder of research materials in her lap. "But you don't have to. Besides, I'm invested now. I want to see this through." The truth was more complicated than that. Over the past few days, as they'd worked together to track down leads and make phone calls, Zara had rediscovered something she'd lost when she'd lost her job: purpose. But more than that, she'd rediscovered the boy who'd shared his lunch with her, and she was falling for the man he'd become. "Mrs. Nakamura packed enough food for a week," Wu Jin observed, glancing at the cooler in the back seat. "I think she's more nervous about this than we are." "She's invested too," Zara said. "We all are." Even Rocky seemed upset that he couldn't come. The dog had indeed been distressed about being left behind, expressing his displeasure by bringing them every toy he owned and looking at them with the kind of betrayed expression that only dogs could master. "Kevin thinks I'm crazy," Wu Jin said quietly. "He thinks I'm setting myself up for disappointment." Kevin Jung had been less than enthusiastic about the Portland trip, arguing that 20 years was too long, that people changed, that Wu Jin was risking his emotional stability on what might be a dead end. He'd made his concerns clear during a tense conversation at the office that Zara had accidentally overheard. "Kevin cares about you," she said diplomatically. "He's trying to protect you from getting hurt." "And what do you think?" Wu Jin asked, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "Do you think I'm setting myself up for disappointment?" Zara considered the question seriously. The rational part of her, the journalist who'd covered enough family reunification stories to know how often they went wrong, wanted to prepare him for the possibility of rejection, indifference, or worse. But the part of her that remembered the boy who'd shared his food, who'd saved half his sandwich for a sister who might never return, couldn't bring herself to extinguish his hope. "I think you're brave," she said finally. "I think you're doing something that most people would be too scared to attempt. And I think that regardless of what happens today, you'll finally have answers instead of questions." The GPS announced their exit, and Wu Jin's tension became palpable as they navigated through Portland's suburban streets toward the address Mrs. Park had provided. The Kim family's current home was a modest 2-story house in a neighborhood that spoke of middle-class stability, well-maintained lawns, children's bicycles in driveways, the kind of place where families put down roots. "This is it," Wu Jin said, pulling into the driveway of a house with a small garden and a Korean flag hanging beside the front door. They sat in the car for a moment, both staring at the house that might contain the answers to 20 years of questions. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and Zara could hear the sound of children playing in a nearby backyard. "What if she doesn't remember me?" Wu Jin asked quietly. "Then you'll remind her," Zara said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "You'll tell her about the kimchi jjigae and the Sunday dinners, and the big brother who never stopped looking for her." Before he could lose his nerve, Wu Jin got out of the car and walked to the front door. Zara followed, her heart pounding as he rang the doorbell. They could hear footsteps inside, and then the door opened to reveal a middle-aged Korean woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. "Mrs. Kim," Wu Jin said in Korean, his voice carefully controlled. The woman nodded, responding in Korean with a questioning tone. Wu Jin spoke again, and Zara watched Mrs. Kim's expression change from polite curiosity to shock to something that might have been recognition. "She remembers Minji," Wu Jin said quietly to Zara, his voice thick with emotion. "She's calling her." Mrs. Kim gestured for them to wait, then disappeared into the house, calling out in Korean. There was a moment of silence, then the sound of footsteps on stairs, and then a voice, a woman's voice, responding from somewhere inside the house. Zara held her breath as the footsteps grew closer. 20 years of searching, 20 years of hope and fear and unanswered questions, all leading to this moment in a suburban Portland doorway. And then she appeared. Minji Kim was 27 years old now, no longer the 7-year-old who'd disappeared from Wu Jin's life. She was petite like her adoptive mother, with long black hair and eyes that were unmistakably familiar. She wore jeans and a sweater that suggested she'd been doing something domestic when her mother called her, and her expression was cautious but curious as she looked at the strangers on her doorstep. "Minji," Wu Jin said softly, and the name came out like a prayer. For a moment, nobody moved. Minji studied Wu Jin's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle, and Zara could see the exact moment when recognition dawned. "Oppa," she whispered, using the Korean word for big brother. And then she was crying, and Wu Jin was crying, and they were hugging in the doorway, while Mrs. Kim wiped her eyes, and Zara tried to process the miracle she was witnessing. "I looked for you," Minji said in English, her voice muffled against Wu Jin's shoulder. "I tried to find you, but they said you'd aged out of the system, and I didn't know your real name, and—" "I know," Wu Jin said, holding her tighter. "I looked for you too. I never stopped looking." Mrs. Kim invited them inside, bustling around to make tea while Minji and Wu Jin sat on the couch, still holding hands like they were afraid the other might disappear again. Zara settled into a chair nearby, feeling like she was witnessing something sacred. "I'm a teacher," Minji said, laughing through her tears. "Just like I always said I would be. I teach 2nd grade at the elementary school down the street." "You always wanted to help kids," Wu Jin said, his voice full of pride and wonder. "You said you'd help kids like us." "I do," she said simply. "I work with kids in the foster system, kids who need extra support, kids who remind me of us. I became the person I wished we'd had when we were little." The conversation that followed was a mixture of catching up, filling in gaps, and marveling at the strange turns their lives had taken. Minji had been happy with the Kim family, loved, supported. Given opportunities she might not have had otherwise. But she'd never forgotten her big brother, never stopped wondering what had happened to him. "I tried to find you when I turned 18, she said, "but Jung Wu Jin is such a common name, and I didn't know you'd moved to Seattle. I even hired a private investigator a few years ago, but he couldn't find any trace of you. I changed my name legally when I was 16, Wu Jin explained. "I wanted to distance myself from the system, from the past. I became someone new." "But you kept our Korean names," Minji observed. "You kept that connection." "I kept everything that mattered," he said, looking at her with 20 years of love and regret. "I just didn't know how to find you." Mrs. Kim returned with tea and what appeared to be a photo album, settling beside her daughter, with the comfortable authority of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for years. "She never stopped talking about you," Mrs. Kim said in accented English. "Every birthday, every holiday, she would wonder where you were, what you were doing. We tried to help her search, but I was hiding," Wu Jin said quietly. "I built walls around myself, created a new identity, became someone who couldn't be found because I was too afraid of being hurt again." Minji squeezed his hand. "You weren't hiding," she said firmly. "You were surviving. We both were. And now we're here and we found each other, and that's what matters." The photo album revealed 20 years of Minji's life. School pictures, family vacations, graduation photos, her first teaching job. Mrs. Kim had documented everything, as if she'd known that someday Minji's brother would want to see what he'd missed. "She talks about you in her sleep sometimes," Mrs. Kim said softly, "even now as an adult. She dreams about a boy who shared his food and promised to always take care of her." "I failed," Wu Jin said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't protect you. I couldn't keep us together." "You were 14, Minji said fiercely. "You were a child yourself. You did everything you could, and when the system separated us, that wasn't your failure. That was the system's failure." Zara, who had been quietly observing this reunion, felt tears streaming down her face. This was why she'd become a journalist, for moments like this, when truth and love and persistence finally paid off, when families found each other again. "I have something for you," Wu Jin said suddenly, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small wrapped package and handed it to Minji with shaking hands. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a small charm in the shape of a kimchi jar, a reference to their Sunday dinners at Chef Kang's restaurant. "I bought this for your 8th birthday, he said quietly. "I've been carrying it for 20 years, waiting for the chance to give it to you." Minji's tears started fresh as she held the bracelet up to the light. You remembered. I remembered everything, Wu Jin said. Every Sunday dinner, every story you told me, every dream you had about becoming a teacher. I remembered all of it. As Minji fastened the bracelet around her wrist, Zara realized that she was witnessing more than just a family reunion. She was witnessing the healing of 20 years of trauma, the restoration of a bond that had been broken but never destroyed, the proof that love really could survive anything. There's someone I want you to meet, Minji said suddenly, looking toward the stairs. Someone who's been waiting to meet you for a very long time, she called out in Korean, and a moment later, a little girl appeared at the top of the stairs, maybe 6 years old with pigtails and Minji's eyes. This is my daughter, Minji said proudly. Your niece. Her name is Grace, but her Korean name is Minseo. Wu Jin stared at the little girl in wonder, and Grace stared back with the fearless curiosity of childhood. She looks like you did at that age, he said softly. She has your stubborn streak, Minji laughed, and your protective instincts. She's always looking out for the younger kids at school. Grace came down the stairs and walked directly to Wu Jin, studying his face with serious concentration. Are you my uncle? She asked in clear English. Yes, Wu Jin said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm your Uncle Wu Jin. Mommy talks about you all the time, Grace said matter-of-factly. She says you used to take care of her when she was little. I tried to, Wu Jin said, and now you found each other again, Grace said with the simple acceptance of a child who believed in happy endings. That's good. Mommy was sad about losing you. The innocence of the observation broke something open in Wu Jin's chest, and he found himself crying again. Not tears of grief this time, but tears of overwhelming gratitude. Would you like to see my room? Grace asked, apparently deciding that her uncle was acceptable. I have pictures of Korea that Mommy gave me, and books in Korean that Halabeoji reads to me. I would love that, Wu Jin said, allowing himself to be led upstairs by his niece. Zara remained in the living room with Mrs. Kim, both women wiping their eyes and marveling at what they'd just witnessed. 20 years, Mrs. Kim said softly. 20 years she's been waiting for this day. He never stopped looking, Zara replied. Even when it seemed hopeless, he never gave up. And you, Mrs. Kim asked perceptively, what's your story? You're not just a friend helping with the search. Zara smiled, thinking about the boy who'd shared his lunch and the man who'd shared his heart. I'm someone who knew them both a long time ago, she said. Someone who's been looking for them too, in a way. Upstairs they could hear Grace's voice explaining her room to Wu Jin, and Minji's laughter as she joined the tour, the sound of family reconnecting, of love finding its way home after 20 years of separation. Some stories, Mrs. Kim said wisely, are worth waiting for. The drive back to Seattle was different from the morning's tense journey south. Wu Jin's hands were relaxed on the steering wheel, and there was a lightness in his expression that Zara had never seen before. In the back seat, carefully secured, was a box of photos and mementos that Minji had insisted he take. 20 years of her life that she wanted to share with the brother she'd never forgotten. She's coming to Seattle next weekend, Wu Jin said, still sounding like he couldn't quite believe it. She wants to see where I live, meet the people who've become my family. She wants Grace to see the restaurant where we used to eat. Chef Kang is going to cry, Zara predicted. He's been planning that reunion meal for 3 days. Mrs. Nakamura is going to spoil Grace rotten, Wu Jin added with a smile. She's already talking about taking her to Pike Place Market and teaching her to make cookies. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the magnitude of what had happened. The impossible had become possible, the lost had been found, and 20 years of grief had transformed into joy in the space of a single afternoon. I owe you everything, Wu Jin said suddenly, his voice serious. If you hadn't knocked over those papers, if you hadn't recognized that photo, if you hadn't pushed me to search. You would have found her eventually, Zara interrupted. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but you would have found her. Love like that doesn't just disappear. But I might have wasted more years being afraid, he said. More years building walls instead of bridges. You gave me the courage to hope again. The words hung between them. loaded with meaning that went beyond their shared mission to find Minji. Over the past week, as they'd worked together and shared meals and built something that felt like family, Zara had begun to hope for things she'd thought were beyond her reach. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we go home," Wu Jin said. "We tell Mrs. Nakamura and Rocky and Chef Kang that we found her. We plan for next weekend's visit. We figure out how to be a family again." And after that, Wu Jin was quiet for a long moment, and Zara wondered if she'd pushed too hard, asked for too much. But then he reached over and took her hand, intertwining their fingers with the same gentle certainty he'd shown when sharing his lunch all those years ago. "After that," he said, "we figure out what comes next. Together." The word together sent warmth spreading through Zara's chest. She'd spent so many years being independent, being strong, being the person who didn't need anyone. But sitting in Wu Jin's car, holding his hand while Seattle's skyline grew larger on the horizon, she realized that maybe the strongest thing she could do was let herself be loved. "I should probably find a real apartment," she said practically. "Mrs. Nakamura has been wonderful, but I can't live in her guest room forever." "Actually," Wu Jin said, his voice carrying a note of nervous hope, "I have a proposition for you." Zara raised an eyebrow. "What kind of proposition?" "The kind where you stop pretending to be a maid and start being what you actually are. An investigative journalist with a talent for finding missing people." "I'm not sure there's much of a market for that in Seattle," Zara said, though her heart was starting to race with possibility. "There is if you create the market," Wu Jin said. "Young Security Solutions has been looking to expand into family reunification services, missing persons cases, adoption searches, families separated by circumstances beyond their control. We have the resources, the connections, the legal framework. What we don't have is someone with your skills and experience." "Are you offering me a job?" Zara asked, hardly daring to believe it. "I'm offering you a partnership," Wu Jin corrected. "Equal shares, equal say in how we run the division, equal investment in helping other families find what we found today." The offer was more than Zara had dared to hope for. Not just employment, but purpose, not just a job, but a mission that mattered. She thought about all the families out there who were living with the same grief and uncertainty that Wu Jin had carried for 20 years. All the children who'd been separated from siblings and parents and were still searching for their way home. "There's one condition," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Name it." "Rocky gets to be our office mascot. I think he'd be good at comforting clients." Wu Jin's laughter filled the car, rich and genuine and full of the joy that came from finding everything you'd thought you'd lost. "Deal," he said. "Though I should warn you, he's going to expect treats and belly rubs as part of his compensation package. I think we can manage that." As they pulled into the parking garage beneath Wu Jin's building, Zara felt like she was coming home to a life she'd never imagined possible. A life where her skills mattered, where her past had led to something meaningful, where the boy who'd shared his lunch had grown into a man who wanted to share his future. "Mrs. Nakamura is going to want to hear everything," Wu Jin said as they gathered their things from the car. "She's probably been pacing her apartment since we left. And Chef Kang will want to start planning the menu for next weekend," Zara added. "And Kevin will want to know if you're sure about this partnership idea." "I'm sure about a lot of things," Wu Jin said, stopping in the elevator to look at her seriously. "I'm sure that finding Minji was worth 20 years of searching. I'm sure that you're the reason it happened, and I'm sure that I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure other families get the same chance we got." "And what about us?" Zara asked, her heart in her throat. "What are you sure about when it comes to us?" The elevator dinged as they reached their floor, but Wu Jin didn't move to get out. Instead, he cupped her face in his hands and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm sure that I've been looking for you my whole life," he said softly. "I just didn't know it until you walked into my office and recognized the boy I used to be." And then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, while the elevator doors closed around them and Rocky's excited barking echoed from somewhere down the hall. When they finally broke apart, Zara was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "I think Mrs. Nakamura is going to be insufferable about this," she said. She's been predicting this outcome since day one. Mrs. Nakamura is wise, Wu Jin said, finally pressing the button to open the elevator doors. We should listen to her more often. They emerged into the hallway to find Mrs. Nakamura's door already open, the elderly woman standing in her doorway with Rocky at her side and an expression of barely contained excitement on her face. "Well?" she demanded before they'd even reached Wu Jin's door. "Did you find her? Is she well? Does she remember? And why are you both glowing like you've been struck by lightning?" "We found her," Wu Jin said simply, and Mrs. Nakamura's face crumpled with joy. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, pressing her hands to her heart. "I've been praying all day. Tell me everything, every detail, every word, every moment." Rocky, apparently sensing the celebratory mood, began spinning in circles and barking with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for dinner time or the arrival of the mail carrier. "She's a teacher," Zara said, unable to contain her own excitement. "Just like she always said she'd be. And she has a daughter, Grace. Wu Jin has a niece." "A niece?" Mrs. Nakamura clasped her hands together. "Oh, this building is going to be so much livelier with the little one visiting. I'll have to stock up on cookies and juice boxes." "She's coming next weekend," Wu Jin said, unlocking his apartment door. "She wants to meet everyone, see where I live, visit Chef Kang's restaurant." "Next weekend," Mrs. Nakamura repeated, and Zara could practically see the wheels turning in her head. "That gives me exactly 7 days to prepare. I'll need to call Chef Kang, coordinate with Kevin, make sure the guest room is perfect for when Grace stays over." "Mrs. Nakamura," Wu Jin said gently, "you don't have to—" "Nonsense," she interrupted. "This family has been separated for 20 years. Now that you're together again, we're going to make sure every moment is perfect." Rocky had apparently decided that the conversation was taking too long and began herding them all toward Wu Jin's apartment, using the same techniques he employed when trying to get everyone to the kitchen at dinner time. "I think Rocky wants to celebrate too," Zara laughed, allowing herself to be guided inside. The apartment felt different now, not like the intimidating penthouse of a successful businessman, but like home. The childhood photograph was still on Wu Jin's desk, but it was no longer hidden. Instead, it sat in a place of honor, next to a new photo Minji had given him, a recent picture of her and Grace at the beach, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. "I should call Kevin," Wu Jin said, pulling out his phone. "He's going to want to know how it went." "And I should call Nicole," Zara added. "She's been texting me updates requests every hour since we left." But neither of them moved to make their calls. Instead, they stood in the living room, still processing the magnitude of what had happened, still marveling at how quickly their lives had changed. 20 years, Wu Jin said softly. 20 years of wandering, and it's over in a single afternoon. Not over, Zara corrected. Beginning. This is where the real story starts. Learning how to be siblings again, how to build new relationships, how to blend your lives together. And figuring out how to run a family reunification business, Wu Jin added with a smile. "I have a feeling we're going to be very busy." Mrs. Nakamura, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up from her position by the window. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about helping other families find each other." "What about it?" Zara asked. "Well, I may be retired, but I still have contacts throughout the social services system, and I know other people our age who've been through similar experiences, people who lost touch with siblings, parents who were separated from children, families broken apart by circumstances beyond their control. You want to help," Wu Jin realized. "I want to be part of something that matters," Mrs. Nakamura said simply. "Harold and I never had children of our own, but we always believed in the importance of family. If I can help other people find what you found today, then maybe that's how I'm supposed to spend my golden years." Rocky barked his approval of this plan, then trotted over to his toy box and began selecting items to bring to the group. Apparently his contribution to the new family business. "We're going to need a bigger office," Zara said, watching the dog distribute toys with the seriousness of someone conducting important business. "And better coffee," Mrs. Nakamura added. "If we're going to be working together, I refuse to drink that swill from the machine downstairs." "And a proper filing system," Wu Jin said, looking around his apartment with new eyes. We can't run a professional operation out of my dining room table. Actually, Zara said slowly, an idea forming. What if we didn't try to be completely professional? What if we created something different? A place that feels more like home than an office, where families feel comfortable sharing their stories. You mean like a family center, Mrs. Nakamura said, catching on immediately. Somewhere warm and welcoming, where people don't feel like they're just another case number. Exactly, Zara said, her excitement building. We could have a children's area for when clients bring kids, a kitchen for serving tea and comfort food, spaces that feel safe and nurturing. And Rocky, Woojin added, looking at his dog with new appreciation. Research shows that therapy animals help people feel more comfortable sharing difficult information. Therapy animal, Mrs. Nakamura repeated with amusement. Rocky, did you hear that? You're going to be a therapy animal. Rocky responded by bringing her his favorite rope toy and sitting at her feet with an expression of professional dignity that was somewhat undermined by his enthusiastically wagging tail. The conversation that followed was a mixture of practical planning and wild dreaming, where they'd locate their new center, how they'd structure their services, what kind of cases they'd take on first. But underneath the logistics was something deeper, the recognition that they'd all found something they'd been searching for, even if they hadn't known they were looking. I should probably warn you, Woojin said, as the evening wound down, that this isn't going to be easy. Some of the families we help won't have happy endings like ours. Some searches will end in disappointment or rejection, or worse. I know, Zara said quietly. But some will end in joy. Some will end with siblings finding each other after 20 years, or parents reuniting with children they thought they'd lost forever. And even the difficult cases. Maybe we can help people find closure or peace, or just the knowledge that they tried everything they could. Besides, Mrs. Nakamura added pragmatically, life isn't supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be meaningful. And helping families find each other, that's about as meaningful as it gets. Rocky, apparently deciding that the conversation had gone on long enough without proper attention being paid to him, stood up and began his evening routine of demanding belly rubs from everyone in the room. It was a ritual that had become familiar over the past week, and as Zara found herself on the floor scratching behind his ears while Mrs. Nakamura rubbed his belly and Woojin provided commentary on his dog's shameless attention-seeking behavior, she realized that this was what family looked like. Not perfect, not conventional, but real. A collection of people who'd found each other through circumstance and chosen to stay together through love. Minji is going to fit right in, she said, imagining Woojin's sister joining their chaotic little group. Grace too, Mrs. Nakamura added. Children always make everything better. And Chef Kang, Woojin said, he's basically adopted all of us at this point. And Kevin, once he gets over his shock about the career change, Zara added. And Officer Walsh, who's going to be very relieved to learn that you're not actually running a criminal organization, Mrs. Nakamura said with a grin. The mention of Officer Walsh reminded them all of how much had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, Zara had been sleeping in her car, convinced that her life was falling apart. 7 days ago, Woojin had been hiding from his past, afraid to hope for a future that included the people he'd lost. 7 days ago, they'd been strangers brought together by coincidence and a 20-year-old photograph. Now they were family. I love you, Woojin said suddenly, the words falling into the comfortable silence like a stone into still water. Zara looked up from where she was scratching Rocky's ears, her heart skipping at the simple declaration. I love you too, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. I love all of you, Mrs. Nakamura announced, apparently not wanting to be left out of the moment. You've made an old woman very happy. Rocky barked his agreement, then rolled over to expose his belly for maximum rubbing efficiency. Even you attention-seeking furball, Zara laughed, obliging with the requested belly rubs. Outside, Seattle's lights twinkled in the darkness, and somewhere in Portland, Minji was probably tucking Grace into bed and telling her about the uncle she'd finally found. Somewhere in the city, other families were missing each other, searching for each other, hoping for the kind of miracle that had brought them all together. Tomorrow, they'd start planning their new business, Tomorrow, they'd begin the work of helping other people find their way home. Tomorrow, they'd take the first steps toward building something bigger than themselves. But tonight, they were simply a family gathered in a living room, sharing love and laughter, and the kind of contentment that came from knowing that sometimes, against all odds, the impossible really did become possible. "So," Mrs. Nakamura said eventually, "who's going to call Chef Kang and tell him the good news? Because if we don't call him soon, he's going to show up here with enough food to feed an army and demand a full report." "I'll call him," Wu Jin said, reaching for his phone. "But I'm warning you all, once he knows Minji is coming next weekend, he's going to start cooking immediately. We're going to be eating Korean food for the next month." "There are worse fates," Zara said contentedly. And as Wu Jin began the phone call that would set Chef Kang into a frenzy of joyful preparation, as Mrs. Nakamura started making lists of everything that needed to be done before Minji's visit, as Rocky settled into his favorite spot on the couch with the satisfaction of a dog who'd successfully trained his humans to provide optimal belly rubs, Zara allowed herself to believe in happy endings, not just for them, but for all the families they'd help in the years to come, all the siblings who'd find each other, all the parents who'd reunite with their children, all the people who'd discover that love really could survive anything, even 20 years of separation, even the failures of systems designed to help, even the fear that some bonds were too broken to repair. Some stories, she realized, were worth waiting for, and some families were worth fighting for, no matter how long it took to bring them home. The Seattle Family Reconnection Center occupied a converted Victorian house in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, its warm yellow exterior and welcoming front porch, a stark contrast to the sterile offices of traditional investigation services. A hand-painted sign by the front door read, "Where love finds a way homey," and underneath, in smaller letters, "Therapy Dog on Duty." Rocky took his duties as Chief Comfort Officer very seriously, greeting each client with the kind of enthusiastic tail wagging that immediately put people at ease. He developed an uncanny ability to sense which visitors needed extra attention, often appearing with his favorite toy, at exactly the right moment to provide distraction during difficult conversations. "Mrs. Patterson," Zara said gently, handing a tissue to the elderly woman sitting across from her desk. "I know this is hard, but the fact that your son has been looking for you too is a good sign. It means he wants this reunion as much as you do." Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes, her hands shaking slightly. 43 years, she said. 43 years since they took him away and told me I'd never see him again. I never stopped thinking about him, never stopped wondering if he was happy, if he was loved." Rocky, sensing distress, padded over and gently placed his head on Mrs. Patterson's knee. The simple gesture of comfort from the therapy dog was enough to ease some of the tension from her shoulders. "He was loved," Zara assured her. "His adoptive family gave him a wonderful life. But he always knew he was adopted, and he's been searching for you since he turned 18. He just didn't have enough information to find you until now." Through the office window, Zara could see Wu Jin in the garden with Grace, who was visiting for her monthly weekend in Seattle. At 7 years old, Grace had appointed herself as the center's unofficial junior assistant, helping to water the plants and organize the children's play area with the seriousness of someone conducting important business. "Uncle Wu Jin," Grace was saying, her voice carrying through the open window, "I think the flowers need more water, and maybe some of those plant vitamins you use." "You're absolutely right," Wu Jin replied solemnly. "What would I do without my gardening consultant?" The sight of them together, uncle and niece bonding over soil and seedlings, never failed to make Zara smile. Minji had been right when she'd said that Grace had inherited Wu Jin's protective instincts. The little girl had taken to her uncle immediately, and their relationship had become one of the unexpected joys of the past 6 months. "When will I meet him?" Mrs. Patterson asked, drawing Zara's attention back to the conversation. "Next week, if you're ready," Zara said. "He's flying in from Denver specifically for this meeting. He's just as nervous as you are, but just as excited." Mrs. Patterson nodded, clutching Rocky's rope toy like a lifeline. "I've been ready for 43 years, she said. "I just never thought it would actually happen." The front door chimed and Zara could hear Mrs. Nakamura's voice in the reception area, greeting their afternoon appointment with the kind of maternal warmth that had become the center's signature. At 78, Mrs. Nakamura had found her calling as the center's client coordinator, using her decades of life experience and natural empathy to help families navigate the emotional complexities of reunion. "That's my next appointment," Zara said, standing. "But Mrs. Patterson, I want you to remember something. You're not the same person you were 43 years ago, and neither is he. You've both grown, both changed, both built lives that you can be proud of. This reunion isn't about going back to the past. It's about creating a new future together." Mrs. Patterson smiled through her tears. "Thank you, dear, for everything. I don't know how you do this work, how you handle all the emotion, all the hope and fear and heartbreak." "Because of moments like this," Zara said simply. "Because every family we reunite makes it worth it." After Mrs. Patterson left, Zara took a moment to center herself before her next appointment. The work was emotionally demanding in ways she'd never anticipated, but it was also deeply fulfilling. In 6 months, they'd successfully reunited 12 families, provided closure for 8 others, and built a reputation as the place to go when traditional methods had failed. "Knock, knock," Kevin Young said, appearing in her doorway with a stack of files. "I have the background reports you requested for the Morrison case." Kevin had been skeptical about the career change initially, but he'd thrown himself into the family reunification business with the same dedication he'd brought to corporate security. His investigative skills and legal connections had proven invaluable, and he'd developed a particular talent for navigating the bureaucratic maze of adoption records and social services documentation. "Any luck with the sealed records?" Zara asked, accepting the files. "Some," Kevin said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "It took some creative legal maneuvering, but I think we have enough information to locate the Morrison siblings. The trail goes cold in the 1980s, but there are some promising leads in Phoenix." "Phoenix," Zara mused. "That's going to require a road trip. Or we could partner with a local investigator," Kevin suggested. "We've been talking about expanding our network." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of laughter from the garden, where Grace was apparently teaching Wu Jin the proper technique for talking to plants. According to Grace's 7-year-old logic, plants grew better when you told them encouraging things, and she'd convinced her uncle to adopt this practice for the center's garden. "How are they doing?" Kevin asked, following Zara's gaze to the window. "Better than anyone expected," Zara said. Minji was worried that Grace might feel overwhelmed by suddenly having an uncle and a whole new extended family, but she's adapted beautifully. "And Minji?" "Thriving. She loves her new job at the elementary school here, and she and Wu Jin are closer than ever. It's like they picked up right where they left off, but with 20 years of wisdom and experience added to the mix." The truth was that watching Wu Jin reconnect with his sister had been one of the most beautiful things Zara had ever witnessed. The guilt and grief he'd carried for 2 decades had gradually transformed into joy and gratitude, and the change in him was remarkable. He smiled more, laughed more, allowed himself to be vulnerable in ways that would have been impossible before. "Speaking of relationships," Kevin said with a knowing smile, "when are you two going to make it official?" Zara felt her cheeks warm. "We're taking things slow," she said. "There's been a lot of change in both our lives. We want to make sure we're building something solid." "Solid," Kevin repeated with amusement. "Zara, you've been practically living here for 6 months. You run a business together, you're raising Grace together on weekends, you've created a whole new life together. How much more solid do you need?" Before Zara could respond, the office door burst open and Grace came running in, her face flushed with excitement and her hands covered in potting soil. "Zara! Zara!" she called, bouncing on her toes. "Uncle Wu Jin says we can plant a special garden for the families who come here, with flowers that mean hope and love and new beginnings." "That sounds wonderful," Zara said, pulling Grace into a hug despite the dirt. "What kind of flowers did you have in mind?" "Sunflowers for hope, because they're always looking toward the sun," Grace said seriously. "And roses for love, but not the thorny kind, because we want people to feel safe here. And maybe some of those purple flowers that smell really good. What are they called?" "Lavender," Wu Jin said, appearing in the doorway with his own hands covered in soil, "for peace and healing." "Yes, lavender for peace," Grace agreed. And we should have a special place where people can sit and think about their families, with a bench and maybe a little fountain. A meditation garden, Zara said, touched by the 7-year-old's instinctive understanding of what their clients needed. That's a beautiful idea, Grace. Can we start this weekend? Grace asked eagerly. Mommy's coming to visit and she's really good at gardening. She could help us plan it. We'll see what we can do, Woojin said, ruffling his niece's hair. But first, we should probably wash our hands before we track dirt all over Zara's office. And before Mrs. Nakamura sees us, Grace added with the wisdom of someone who'd learned to respect the elderly woman's standards of cleanliness. She gets that look when people bring dirt inside. Kevin laughed, standing to leave. I'll let you handle the garden planning committee, he said. But Zara, think about what I said. Some things are worth making official. After Kevin left, Zara found herself alone with Woojin and Grace. The three of them crowded into her small office, while Rocky supervised from his favorite spot by the window. It was a scene that had become familiar over the past months, the makeshift family they'd created, planning and dreaming and building something beautiful together. Grace, Woojin said gently, why don't you go help Mrs. Nakamura organize the children's books? I need to talk to Zara about something. Grace nodded importantly and skipped out of the office, leaving Zara and Woojin alone for the first time all day. The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with the kind of understanding that came from months of working side by side, sharing hopes and fears and the daily challenges of helping other people rebuild their lives. Kevin's right, you know, Woojin said finally, moving to sit on the edge of her desk, about making things official. Zara's heart skipped, but she kept her voice steady. What kind of official? The kind where I stop pretending that this is just a business partnership and a convenient living arrangement, Woojin said, reaching into his jacket pocket. The kind where I admit that I've been carrying this around for 2 months, waiting for the right moment. He pulled out a small velvet box and Zara's breath caught in her throat. Woojin, she whispered. I know it's crazy, he said quickly. I know we've only been together for 6 months and I know there's still so much we're figuring out. But Zara, I've spent my whole life looking for home, and I found it with you. I found it in this work we're doing, in this family we've built, in the way you make me want to be better than I ever thought I could be. He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a solitaire diamond set in white gold, classic and timeless and perfect. I'm not asking you to change anything about your life or your work or your independence, he continued. I'm just asking you to let me be part of it officially and permanently. I'm asking you to marry me, little Z. The nickname, the one he'd called her when they were children, the one that connected their past to their present, broke down the last of her defenses. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked at this man who'd shared his lunch with her 20 years ago and was now offering to share his life with her. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, of course. Yes. The kiss that followed was interrupted by the sound of applause from the doorway, where Mrs. Nakamura, Kevin and Grace had apparently been eavesdropping with varying degrees of subtlety. Finally, Mrs. Nakamura exclaimed. I was beginning to think you two would never figure it out. I knew it, Grace announced. Mommy owes me $5. I told her Uncle Woojin was going to marry Zara before Christmas. You bet on us? Woojin asked, laughing as he slipped the ring onto Zara's finger. Grace is very observant, Kevin said diplomatically. She called this months ago. Can I be the flower girl? Grace asked, bouncing with excitement. And can Rocky be the ring bearer? And can we have the wedding in our garden when it's finished? Slow down, sweetheart, Zara laughed, pulling Grace into a hug. We just got engaged 5 minutes ago. But you'll think about it, Grace pressed. About the garden wedding? It would be so pretty and all the families we've helped could come and Chef Kang could make the food. We'll think about it, Woojin promised. And Zara could see in his eyes that he was already imagining it, a wedding surrounded by the flowers they'd planted, the families they'd reunited, the community they'd built. I should call Minji, Zara said suddenly. She's going to want to know. She already knows, Grace said matter-of-factly. Uncle Woojin asked her permission last week. She cried happy tears and said it was about time. You asked my sister's permission? Zara asked, touched by the gesture. I asked my sister's permission, Woojin corrected gently. Minji is family now. Your family too. I wanted her blessing before I proposed. The simple statement that Minji was Zara's family now, that the bonds they'd built over the past months were real and permanent, brought fresh tears to her eyes. She'd spent so much of her life feeling alone, feeling like she was on the outside looking in at other people's families. But standing in her office, surrounded by the people who'd chosen to love her, she realized that she'd finally found where she belonged. "Group hug," Grace announced, and suddenly they were all laughing and crying and embracing in the middle of the office, while Rocky barked his approval and the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows. "I love you all," Zara said, her voice muffled by the group hug, but her words clear. "I love this crazy, wonderful family we've built." "Even when we're being nosy and interfering?" Mrs. Nakamura asked with a grin. "Especially then," Zara replied. As the celebration continued around her, Grace already planning wedding details, Mrs. Nakamura offering to coordinate with Chef Kang about catering, Kevin making jokes about having to find a new business partner, Zara caught Woo Jin's eye across the chaos. He was watching her with an expression of pure contentment, and she knew he was thinking the same thing she was. They'd started this journey looking for one missing person, and they'd found so much more. They'd found each other, found their purpose, found a way to turn their own pain into healing for others. They'd built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past, and they'd created a future that neither of them could have imagined 6 months ago. "What are you thinking about?" Woo Jin asked quietly, stepping closer to her as the others continued their excited planning. "I'm thinking about that little boy who shared his lunch," Zara said softly, "and how he grew up to be a man who shares everything, his heart, his home, his mission to help other people find their way back to each other. And I'm thinking about that little girl who was brave enough to accept kindness from a stranger," Woo Jin replied, "and how she grew up to be a woman who makes the impossible possible every single day." Outside, Seattle's evening lights were beginning to twinkle, and somewhere in the city, families were missing each other, searching for each other, hoping for the kind of miracle that had brought them all together. Tomorrow there would be more cases to investigate, more families to reunite, more hearts to heal. But tonight, there was this, a ring on her finger, love in her heart, and the absolute certainty that some stories really did have happy endings, not just for them, but for all the families they'd help in the years to come, all the siblings who'd find each other, all the parents who'd reunite with their children, all the people who'd discover that love really could survive anything. "So," Grace said, appearing at Zara's elbow with the seriousness of someone conducting important business, "when do we start planning the wedding? Because I have a lot of ideas, and Mrs. Nakamura says we should make a list." Zara looked at Woo Jin, who shrugged with the expression of a man who'd learned that resistance was futile when Grace had made up her mind about something. "I guess we start now," Zara said, laughing as Grace produced a notebook from seemingly nowhere and began writing with the determination of someone who took wedding planning very seriously indeed. And as the planning session began in earnest, with Mrs. Nakamura offering opinions on flowers, Kevin suggesting legal considerations, and Rocky contributing by bringing everyone his toys, Zara realized that this was what happiness looked like. Not perfect, not simple, but real and messy and full of love. The kind of love that shared lunch money with hungry children, that searched for missing sisters for 20 years, that turned broken hearts into healing hands. The kind of love that built families from strangers, that created hope from despair, that proved every single day that some bonds really were unbreakable. The kind of love that brought people home.